Hello everybody, welcome back to Polymath. Today I want to talk to you about fascism, and I want to talk to you about it because it's a very emotional, evocative concept. It's one that I've wanted to talk about for ages actually, but there's not a very clear consensus of what it actually is. And considering current affairs and the current global shift towards the right, and in some cases the far right, the question of what fascism is and what distinguishes fascism from other forms of the far right is actually very, very important and very present. So fascism is difficult to define. There's been a lot of debate in the academic community on how it's defined, but a really good place to start is to say that fascism is a sort of antithesis to a different social and political philosophy called liberalism. So fascism is itself a social and political philosophy, which is this counterpoint to liberalism. Now when I say the word liberalism, I don't want you to think of the modern word liberal, describing someone who's left-wing in Western society. They're just not the same thing. So for more of a definition on what liberalism is, what this philosophy is, you can look at episode 28 of Polymath, or you can look at episode 9 of Polymath. I've really talked about it a lot. But liberalism is basically a philosophy, and it's now dominant in the Western world, which asks, what is the point of civilization? What makes a good society? And liberalism is philosophy that says that a good society is one where you have a free and equal association of individuals. And whether you're left-wing or right-wing in Western society, you'll disagree on the meaning and the interpretation of the words free and equal and individual, but the basic meaning of liberalism is that people should have rights, they should consent to be governed, people are fundamentally equal, as in, for example, feudalism, as in an inherent hierarchy in society, is inherently morally wrong. And it takes the view that people should be seen as inherently worthy, that simply being an individual, your worth as a human being should be based on you as an individual having the capacity to feel happiness or harm. Your worth as a human being should not be based on what social class you're a part of. Because then that means that if you're part of a low status social class, you have a less high inherent worth than someone from a high status social class. So that's what liberalism means by the words individualism. Another really key tenet of liberalism is that when we take moral decisions, when we think about what is right and what is wrong, what's good and what's evil, that moral decision making needs to be based on reason. We need to use the human faculty of reason to think about what would cause happiness and what would cause harm. Or, if not that specifically utilitarian mindset, the basic principle that reason should be the basis of moral decision making. What should not be the basis of moral decision making in the philosophy of liberalism is appeals to authority, appeals to tradition, and appeals to religion. Liberalism explicitly says when we want to figure out what's right and wrong in society, we can't appeal to these three sources of authority. We have to figure it out ourselves using reason. Now this all sounds really, really basic to us. We really take this for granted in the Western world. This has not been the case for about 95% of human history. So since states began in the 4th millennium BC, all the way up until the 1700s, liberalism as a political philosophy didn't even exist. And it only became mainstream in Western society throughout the 1800s, and then by extension throughout the 1900s as well. The basic tenets of liberalism were accepted throughout the 1800s, and then the consequence of that, for example, equal rights for women and minorities, etc., were accepted in Western society throughout the 1900s. Fascism explicitly opposes this. It is an explicitly anti-liberalist ideology. So Goebbels really formulated this best by saying that he wanted to wipe out history since the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was this social and political movement in Western Europe in the 1700s when liberalism as a philosophy came into being. The Enlightenment is the movement that brought this ideology into being. And Goebbels said that he wanted to go back since before the Enlightenment. So in fascism, in liberalism, things like violence are not seen as inherently good. You have to justify the use of violence. The use of violence and force are wrong unless justified. However, in fascism and in all belief systems that are opposed to liberalism, so for all human societies since the 4th millennium BCE up until liberalism was formulated in the 1700s, they all felt this as well. Fascism and pre-liberalist societies do not see violence and war as inherently wrong. In fact, fascism sees violence and war as good things, and that violence and war are a means to national rejuvenation, national prestige, dominance over the nation over other nations, dominance of superior social classes over inferior social classes, and dominance of a political elite against society. Violence and war are seen as good, valuable means of establishing national and often racial supremacy. That's a really important point in fascism. And this is accompanied by militarism, the glorification and lionization of the military as the arm of exerting this military force and waging this war. So there's this glorification in fascism of military institutions, of military aesthetics, which is mimicked at all levels of society when possible, military values, so military values such as honor, strength, courage, and bravery, at the expense of non-military, traditionally associated with as feminine values such as empathy, kindness, humility, and modesty. So there's a de-emphasis of those in favor of martial values and a glorification of the use of force. So fascism also promotes traditional masculinity, especially the belief that male value and male worth should be conceptualized in terms of social dominance and aggression towards other men. It also supports, and this is part and parcel of traditional masculinity, subordination of women, so relegation of women to household work rather than working and being the provider for society, and relegation of women to non-dominant roles in society, relegation of women away from positions of power in society. Fascism also supports mass mobilization. So the point of fascism is that it's meant to penetrate all levels of society. A fascist consciousness is meant to mobilize and pervade the minds of all individuals in a society. People are expected to believe and be loyal to fascism, rather than being politically passive and apolitical and just blindly obedient. People in fascism are expected to be obedient, and they are expected never to deviate from source of authority, but they're also expected to want that and to be a sort of willing cog in that political machine, rather than just an acquiescent cog in that political machine. And fascism really, it touts itself as a class alliance between the elite and the mob. So that quote, an alliance between the elite and the mob, is a quote by Hannah Arendt, this political philosopher which wrote a lot about totalitarianism. And it's this sort of class alliance, it deplays class conflict in favor of national conflict. So the defining characteristic in a fascist society is not your social class, but your nationality, and often your ethnicity as well. So fascism is all about pursuing ethno-nationalist interests. And to do so, it relegates class divisions and class divides. It seeks to unite different social and economic classes in society in pursuit of ethno-nationalist supremacy worldwide and within society. And then also, fascism classically involves a charismatic, autocratic leadership, where power is manifested in one charismatic leader who is the focal point of the ideology, the focal point of society in general, and a focal point of morals and values in society. So what they say and what they believe is touted as the right thing in society. So it's important to just analyze that idea of an alliance between the elite and the mob. Because unlike traditionalism, so unlike pre-liberalist societies, the elite was explicitly defined against the mob. The masses of society were explicitly kept out of education. They were kept out of the realm of politics. They were deemed to be brutish, simple commoners whose role was only to perform menial labor and just be sheepishly acquiescent to authority. But fascism is different because of this idea of mass mobilization. You are still expected to be totally obedient to authority. However, fascism is populist. It seeks to it frames itself as something to benefit the common man. It frames itself as an ideology in favor of the common man's interests. Even when, as of course, in a totalitarian state, your interests as the common man are not being served, even when fascism does not actually benefit individuals in that society. So that's a really, really important kind of aspect of it. It seeks to change society as a whole. Fascism seeks to remodel a society in a fascist image, unlike pre-liberalist ideologies, which don't seek to change society as a whole. They just seek to maintain hierarchy and order. But fascism is a society-defining ideology. It has to define every aspect of society. It has to pervade every social class. It has to define things like family values, sexuality, hobbies, basic kind of moral values and norms in society. It has to pervade everything. So it demands people's commitment rather than acquiescence, which is what I said earlier. And to do this, fascism will collaborate with traditional elites, such as aristocrats or big business leaders. It collaborates with them, it works with them, and it maintains their position of power. So fascism is all about maintaining hierarchy in society. It's all about inherent hierarchy. And by doing this, it wins over traditional elites, as we see, for example, in the interwar years of fascism, but it spins the focus, it conceptualizes hierarchy in a slightly different way. For example, traditional aristocrats don't seek to change society as a whole, whereas fascism does. And in fascism, traditional elites like aristocrats or big business leaders are still allowed to maintain a position of ascendancy and superiority. However, they're expected to ultimately be subservient to the main kind of political party and indeed the main dictator in a fascist society. So the ultimate crest of a fascist society is always that charismatic authoritarian leadership, and traditional elites are still allowed to maintain power but still have to be subservient to that. So fascism, when it comes to defining fascism, there's lots and lots of different definitions, but the academic community has generally agreed that all forms of fascism can be defined as palingenetic ultranationalism. So what does that mean? Nationalism you know about, and ultranationalism is this ultimate aggression in terms of, it's this ultimate assertion of your nation's superiority and the willingness to engage in aggression in order to achieve that superiority and to manifest that superiority. Palingenetic is a little bit hazier. So what that basically means is that fascism utilizes a palingenetic narrative. The idea that the nation was once great, it used to be amazing, it used to be great, but it's no longer great because different social changes, for example, feminism, the expansion of democracy, the expansion of human rights, all these, by the way, were actual examples cited by fascists in the interwar years. But these new social and political additions to society have reduced that form of greatness. Society was once great and now it's degenerate. And fascism is needed to restore that greatness again. That's what's needed with a palingenetic narrative. Now, you'll notice that current forms of the far right extant today also utilize palingenetic narratives. A really big example of this is Donald Trump, who says, "Make America Great Again." Now, I'm not going to get into Donald Trump and current manifestations of the far right and how they're defined and how they're sort of defined in terms of fascism. I'm going to get into that in a later episode. What I want to make clear is, first of all, I'm not trying to push an agenda on you, and second of all, calling Trump a fascist from a political science perspective isn't really accurate. However, as a far right populist, lots of the narratives and the concepts and the psychological techniques that Trump and other far-right figures such as Modi, Netanyahu, Boris Johnson, etc., these techniques that they utilize are often shared in common with fascism. But fascism is more specific than just far-right populism. It's an incarnation of far-right populism. So while something like palingenetic ultranationalism applies to all forms of fascism, it also applies to other far-right populist ideologies and ideologues, such as, for example, Donald Trump. And you might think, well, Donald Trump isn't far-right. I'm not asking you to agree with that. I'm going to explain that in a future episode. That's just an aside, because it's something that I feel like I should at least touch on, even if I'm not going to get into full depth. So anyway, fascism. Another thing that fascism argues is that human beings are not inherently equal. There are inherent natural hierarchies of human beings based on things like ethnicity and sex. And not only is the goal of society to maintain that hierarchy and enforce the superiority of some groups over others, but subversions of that hierarchy and attempts to subvert that hierarchy, for example with feminism or racial equality or extensive workers' rights, are morally wrong and need to be countered. That's a really important feature. So, and not only that, but attempts to subvert that hierarchy need to be countered with violence, and that hierarchy needs to be maintained with violence. So fascist regimes don't make a secret about their unrestrained use of force. They don't make a secret about having a strong police force with wide-ranging powers and no basic civil or political rights, and with no restraints on to what extent the police can use violence. Fascism does not deny any of these things. It doesn't acknowledge them as bad things because violence is seen as a legitimate mechanism for maintaining hierarchies in society. Now, another thing, fascism explicitly rejects the use of reason in making political and moral decisions. Fascism is an irrationalist philosophy. It denigrates things like science and scientific experts and scientific research. Again, these are all trends which are observable in the modern far right. For example, Trump conduct regarding the CDC and Anthony Fauci and attempts to discredit science and experts in general. That doesn't make Trump a fascist, but it's just important to note that irrationalism and denigration of reason as a moral tool, as a moral decision-making agent, is common to the far right. But what fascism does, it says that moral and political decisions, what is right, what is moral, should not come from reason and utilitarianism, but should come from authority. So sources of authority, for example, a dictator, decides what is moral in that society, and therefore what political policies need to be enacted to enforce that morality. The source of decision making does not come from reason, it comes from authority. It doesn't come from appeals to religion, but it comes from appeals to tradition. And that's a very, very important distinction. And that's actually a key part of that palingenetic narrative. The reversion and the subversion of tradition is a morally degrading force. It's a bad thing. So, and fascism utilizes lots of mysticism, lots of cults of personality, lots of rationalist aesthetics, lots of this kind of, it gives this idea of, it's difficult to describe, but when you look at the language of fascism, it doesn't talk about reason or science or scientific studies. It talks about very abstract, romantic notions, such as greatness or masculinity or strength and aura and honor and courage. And the romanticism and the aesthetic of these sort of concepts is used to impart legitimacy and sort of mysticism onto the fascist aesthetic. And again, fascism might draw on traditional religion to mobilize support, and it will often present itself as a defender of religion, but ultimately, fascism seeks to create a kind of secular religion, where the object of worship is not a god, it's not a deity, but the autocrat itself, himself, as quasi-divine and deserving of worship. And fascism encourages this hyper-authoritarianism. It encourages people to transfer trust and moral legitimacy onto that leader by using this technique of scapegoating. It will find some kind of scapegoat in society. 100 years ago that was Jews and communists, now it's immigrants, and it will raise fear about that threat. It will find this scapegoat. It would say, this scapegoat is subverting society and causing moral problems. I am the defender of that. By vesting power in me, I will solve this problem. Trust me, put your faith in me, and I will deal with that. Now, I actually talk about that a lot in episode 16, about how democracies elect dictators, because many dictators use the exact same psychological techniques to get people to vote for them. Because what's happening is, by raising fear in a population, by raising hatred in a population, you make them much more willing to sign away, to sort of give away civil and political rights, because fear is a very, very powerful motivator. So fascism uses this extensively. So immigrants, Muslims, these are the current scapegoats used, but different societies will draw on different scapegoats. It's just that right now in the West, we're seeing Muslims and immigrants as these scapegoats. So fascism is ultra-authoritarian, as we've described, and it's ultra-conservative. Its socio-cultural values are highly conservative. So it starts on things like feminism and women's rights, racial equality, abortion, divorce, euthanasia. These are all the most conservative stances possible. And in a deeper sense, in its views on violence and reason, it also takes an ultra-conservative stance. What's perhaps a bit less obvious is what fascism says about the economy. The economics of fascism are a bit more complex. So fascism does adopt the economic system of capitalism. This might surprise you, because you might associate capitalism itself with liberal democracies and Western democracies. That's not the case. Capitalism and Western democracy happened to grow up together simultaneously in the 1800s. And that's not a coincidence, and I talk about that in episode 7. But capitalism is a system of economics. It's compatible with lots of different social and political philosophies, and it's compatible with the socio-political philosophy that is fascism. So capitalism essentially is when the means of production are owned privately and operated for profit. So what that means is that in capitalism, stuff that you need to make things, such as land or factories or machines or tools or raw materials, are not owned by society as a whole. They're owned by individuals and firms. And that's private property. So private property is ownership over means of production. It's not the same as just owning consumer goods like your toothbrush or your house or your laptop. That's personal property. So capitalism is when private property exists, and private property is owned to make profit. The goal of owning private property is not to serve some greater societal goal. So for example, a big business such as Tesla does not operate in order to benefit society, it operates in order to make profit for that own business. That is the economic system of capitalism, but I talk about that a lot more in episode 29, I believe. So fascism fundamentally respects that. Fascism operates under capitalism, and it recruits big business and corporate elites onto its side because it allows them to maintain their power and economic influence. However, in fascism, it's not free market capitalism. So in fascism, some important industries are owned by the state, for example, maybe energy or armaments, and the state intervenes in the economy both as a regulator and an active participant. So in fascism, there's a phenomenon called economic planning, which is when the state or some other kind of body in society, in the case of fascism is the state, essentially dictates, it makes decisions on what gets made and how what gets made gets distributed to people. So that's opposed to a market. A market economy is another resource allocation mechanism wherein economic rules such as supply and demand determines what gets made and who gets what. So fascism utilizes a market economy, but it also incorporates elements of planning. So this is known as state capitalism. It's a form of capitalism called state capitalism. I talk about it a lot more in episode 11 of Polymath. And fascism essentially markets itself as this kind of middle way. It markets itself as this middle way between free market capitalism and a socialist economy. Indeed, fascism is virulently opposed to socialism. It's also virulently opposed to trade unions because, again, a trade union is a source of power for workers. And fascism opposes any other kind of locus of power other than the central authority. So trade unions in fascism are both strictly forbidden and also actively demonized. But the state does allow some kind of labor association to exist. It just tells them what to do and it makes them cooperate with big business. And in exchange for labor cooperating with big business, they're given some kind of social security and welfare concessions. Not as much as in other societies. For example, just a random example, the Nordic model now, the degree of social security and welfare is much higher than in fascist societies, but in fascist societies, it's not just free market capitalism. There's some degree of social support, which is actually ironic because fascists often try to limit social welfare policies because fascism is a philosophy that believes in social Darwinism. It believes that just as in nature different animals compete, in human society, different human beings and different races and different social classes compete. And weak individuals and weaker races and weaker social classes that cannot win in competition should not be supported by society. They should not be supported by the state. They are inherently inferior and it is the course of nature for them to die out. So by backing social welfare policies, fascism actually violates its own tenet of social Darwinism because you're supporting individuals who are ostensibly weak and deserve the treatment that they get due to their own inferiority. However, fascists often backed social welfare as a means of securing social support. So this kind of, again, this middle way, this middle marketing between free market capitalism and socialism is why the Nazis originally called themselves National Socialists. I want to make absolutely clear, not only is fascism virulently opposed to socialism, but fascism is not like socialism in any sense of the word. It's not like socialism in terms of its political values, its social cultural values, its economic values. It is in fact almost diametrically opposed to everything that socialism is. It's the sort of like how North Korea calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, but it's not at all democratic. National Socialism has nothing to do with socialism. I cannot make that more clear. And for more information on what socialism actually is, watch episode 12 of Polymath. So, that is today's episode on fascism. I hope that you enjoyed that and found it useful. I'm going to do another episode in the future on the psychology of fascism and what makes people fascist, but that's going to be an episode for another time. I hope you're all doing really, really well. I hope that was useful for you guys, and I wish you all the best. Take care.